I would like to invite our first panel. We're gonna be talking about the state of wine and spirits education. So I would like to invite Brianne Cohn, and then I'd also like to invite Elliot Clark. And then if I can get Rafaela de la Vega on stage with me as well. Major congratulations to these three right here. Brianne, so obviously as a wine writer, wine educator, you have a huge education background, but can you share a little bit more about yourself?
Brianne Cohen. I'm here, first of all, in community and collaboration with everyone here. There's a lot of people I don't know, so please find me after. I'd love to chat and connect. But I am based in Los Angeles. I'm a certified sommelier, wine educator, and wine writer. On the education side, I focus on delivering interactive, in-person, and virtual wine tasting experiences for corporate groups, with the goal of engaging and building culture with internal teams, and then also allowing salespeople to connect with their clients and prospects. And I do this through highlighting diverse-owned and diverse-made wines, so Black, BIPOC, LGBT, and female-owned and made wines. On the writing side, I freelance for many different publications, including my own website, but also Decanter, Wine Business Monthly, 750 Daily, Business Insider, and a few others. Thank you.
Chingona. How about you, Elliot? Obviously here with us from the spirit side of the world, which I know zero about, considering I could not understand how to make a cocktail last night when we were trying. Can you share anything else about you? And thank you for being here from Colorado.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm really stoked to be here, so I appreciate you having me. To my friends, I'm known as the drink guy, but I have a site dedicated to making cocktails and spirits approachable for people at home called Apartment Bartender. So I've been in the social media game for about 10 years now, which is crazy to say. I started it pre the term influencer. And so for the past 10 years, I really have been deep diving into, again, the world of spirits, cocktails, and just really wanting to make that approachable for people at home. I'm an author as of this year, which is really exciting. And so, what I say most is that just at heart, I'm a drink nerd. I'm a cocktail nerd. I love the aspect of just seeing everything that goes into the process of spirit production, of the industry and on-premise accounts, and how they create drink menus for consumers and stuff. And that's something that I was always really swept up in. I love the hospitality industry, and so for me, I just wanted to take that and learn how to do it at home. And so I wanted to also demystify that process for people at home. And so that's what I'm really passionate about. So, I'm very excited to meet everyone here and to learn more about your story and to share what knowledge that I have, working in the social media industry, working in content creation, and just the creative aspect of the spirits industry, and to share what knowledge I've accumulated, what little knowledge I've accumulated in a decade. So again, I appreciate you having me.
Absolutely, and we're so excited to have you. And Rafaela, previously with WSET and now Michelin, two very, very cool jobs. What else can you share about yourself?
Awesome. Thank you so much. And how to follow up this awesome group already. Thank you all for being here. I'm Rafaela de la Vega. I used to work with WSET, so I'll probably be speaking to that experience a lot during this. But my role with WSET was in APP development for primarily what we would call Latin America, so anything Mexico, Central, South America, but also the West Coast of the US, and other pockets throughout the US. So I would encourage a lot of our providers on how they were doing different teaching methods. I would also be part of the educator training program, so teaching our educators how to standardize the process, but also lean into, what is the context of the student experience, which I'll talk to in a little bit. But really that whole experience, 3.5 years with WSET, gave me such a great eye into the world of wine beyond just the US, and stepping across borders, seeing it in different cultures, different settings with a lot of different people. And even within the US, I got to work with some amazing organizations, got to work with the Roots Fund, I see you, Aikimi, and just working with all of these different worlds, and bringing wine to people through our language. So, loved it.
Which we love, and that's why we're here, to celebrate our talento Latino in all of the different places we come from, Salvadoreña right here, and Mexicana. My dad would kill me if I didn't also shout out my Mexican roots. But we come from all sorts of different backgrounds and places, and learning about wine, learning about spirits is the exact same way. And as you can see, 3 very diverse backgrounds here. So I kind of, before we even get into where are we at with wine and spirits education, I want to ask sort of, how are we thinking about education? Maybe let's set the stage, set the framework. You can have very technical education like WSET. You can have hands-on learning experiences that provide wealth of value, especially if you've had 20-something years of experience in a role. So I guess can each of you share sort of what does education really look like for you, and what do you think of when you hear that word as it relates to what you do?
I guess I'll start. So I went through the WSET program. So just hearing that you worked for them, I'm like, oh, just all those memories of the tests and all the things and all the money spent. But I went through the WSET program all the way through the diploma. And I think I look at wine education in 2 different buckets. So I think you have, when you're talking to people who are pursuing certifications, people who work in the industry, in the trade, and that's sort of our own little world. Then you have the rest of the world out in the wild. And to me, the term wine education actually means absolutely nothing. How boring than to talk to somebody who loves wine and say, I'm going to educate you about wine. So I really try to turn that over on its head. And I try not to use that word, although it just sort of naturally just makes sense so people understand. And as I always say, my goal is to help people drink better and up their wine game, whatever that means to them. Better doesn't mean more expensive. I just want to give them little tidbits, little bits of information that is going to improve their tasting experience. So for me, bottom line, whether we're industry, trade, students, or just regular wine drinkers, it's all about that sensory experience, how we're engaging and connecting with the wine in the glass.
Awesome. I couldn't agree more, especially because tasting is part of the reason why we're even drinking it to begin with. Elliot, does that look a lot different on the spirit side of things as it relates to education? And I know, you clearly just wrote a book on Let's Do Drinks, so I'm sure people are diving into that, trying to figure out how do I come to understand the spirits world.
Well, I honestly think that how you said it is perfect, because for me, when I first started, I would go to a cocktail bar, I'd see a drink, taste it, want to recreate it at home. I'd look up some of the ingredients, and it just felt very overwhelming. And so the educational part for doing hospitality at home, I think so much of it is more about the experience, more about what you're tasting, more about how you can take something that you're experiencing at a bar and recreate it at home, knowing that you're on a budget and you're doing things, with limited resources or what you can find at a grocery store. So, for me, I'm also very visual, being a creative. And so, education is one consistent. I think education is also just about making things, not as making things digestible, right? Because with social media content, you need to create content and put stuff out consistently and in a way that people are going to be able to take little bits and be okay, this is a little nugget I can collect that I can remember. And then, you just build on that. And then in terms of, spirits and stuff, when you are, for me, I've been able to travel quite a bit, visit distilleries. I don't have a formal education. My thing is apartment bartender, but ironically, I've never been a bartender or employed behind a bar. I started this when I was working in sales at a software company, and that's just how much of a cocktail nerd I am. But, for me, education has always been very hands-on. It's been very experiential. And so I think that's really important. And again, being very visual, I'm a big believer in making things beautiful, making things pretty. So when it comes to spirits and cocktails, I'm very big into how the drink looks. I'm very big into product, packaging, your branding, your marketing, and that stuff, because I think that's stuff that people remember. And it makes them feel something. So I think when it comes to education, again, I'm a big believer, again, just making things digestible, making things beautiful, making things approachable for people in a bite-sized way that they can take and remember. Because in the spirits industry and the wine industry, there's so much information, so much things that, it's so overwhelming. And most people are just I don't really want to invest that time. So if you can take a different approach, I think you're going to make more impact
100% time or money, because WSET, like Brianne said, is very expensive with all those classes, but it's very similar, right? In terms of education, information overload, we're definitely going to get into that. Rafaela, WSET, obviously from the very technical, formal educational side, what do you think of when you think of the word education, and how does that look like in your role?
Yeah, for sure. So I think also just kind of jumping back to when I first got into wine, I'm really curious about this product. I was coming from the tech world and took a WSET level 1 course. And really that was just to like understand the product in its objective form. So really that's what WSET was for me as a student experience jumping into it, was I just want to know how to talk about this and then deliver that over to my friends. And so then we started these little like COVID type of groups during that time. And I got to teach my friends how to taste wine. So it was started out like that. And then I moved to Sonoma and got to experience like the winemaking side of things. So I did a wine harvest internship. Had I not done that wine harvest internship, I don't think I would have passed diploma, because I am such like a hands-on learner and need to understand what the press looks like and what am I doing after that to really put it into words and into context. So when I think about learning, that's my personal experience. Obviously, from the side of WSET, I think it's a great starting point. I think it's an amazing way of kind of standardizing the program, right? Like providing you with a skeleton of information, and then you add on your own personal elements, your own personal anecdotes, and kind of your own personal experiences to that to kind of connect everything together. So when we would talk to our educators during our program, the student experience was the like really big part of our educator training program, which is like a 4-day course. Majority of it was, let's understand the student. And Brianne, you were going to this. What is the context? Like, who are these people that are walking through your door? Are they professionals? Are they enthusiasts? What country do they come from? What language do they speak? What are their favorite foods? Like, let's think about all of those pieces. The other part was, what is important to them? Like, what is their goal out of this? Do they just want to understand how to, look at a wine list and order something for their friends? Do they want to be able to sell a product? So it was a lot of different, questions that you would have to ask yourself as an educator. So anyway, that is when I, think about education in wine. It's like, it's more than just communicating something. It's more about asking a lot of questions about the person that you are in front of before you can get to it.
And I think that's really powerful, because if you don't understand the context of what it is that you're trying to extract, whether it's from somebody learning something that's technical or trying to learn from a, I guess, more fun and enjoyable perspective, you can kind of get a little bit stuck on where are we going from here, right? So along those lines, I think a common theme that we've all talked about is just this sense of information overload. Things can be very overwhelming to learn. Can each of you share a little bit in your own world on what have you found to be the most effective way then of engaging people, and is that through, Rafaela, you mentioned hands-on experience that you had to learn when you finally understood how a press works out. Elliot, you spoke to, having to figure out how to make the cocktails at your house, and now you're this sensation on Instagram. And Brianne, like, you write about this all the time and educate people through tasting experiences. Like, how do you effectively engage people, especially when they're coming from all different sorts of backgrounds, right? Like, we all start in different places. Some of us actually work in the industry. Others of us, we just like to have a glass of wine every single day as soon as we get out of work, because life's exhausting, especially after the pandemic. But what does that actually look like in practice, and how do we get more people to feel engaged or to be interested at a time when, to me, the conversations seem to be like, I don't know where to go from here, or I'm not attracted to the wine space or the spirit space because it's too complicated to learn. And I think we've all continued to say that.
I'll jump on that personally. I think what you said is like really important, of just understanding and asking questions, because when somebody, for me, in terms of like putting out content, it's funny doing it for 10 years, how many times I've taught people how to make like a simple drink, like an old fashioned, and year after year, people still don't know how to make simple syrup, and so I think like, it just seems like every year it's like the same thing. And I think what I've learned through that is, not everybody has the same desire to dive down that rabbit hole that others may have, and so I think it's really important to understand who your audience is and who you're speaking with. And like I think the best way to encourage education is like one-on-one. That can be digital, right? If you're on the social media space, or if you have a brand and you're trying to connect with your audience digitally, but also in person. I have some friends that really want to understand what is the difference between this tequila and that tequila, and learn about the production process. I have other friends that just want to learn how to make a good drink for the holidays, and other times they don't really partake during the year. So yeah, I think it's just you don't want to like just dump information on somebody that's really not trying to learn, and so I think understanding the context of what somebody's trying to get out of it, like you had mentioned, is really important, so that you can understand like who is it that really wants to dive deeper, because it's been, for me 10 years and I'm still learning so much. But I also still want to learn, so I think it's really just understanding like what somebody is trying to get out of it and how much they desire to know about it, because you can't, that saying like you can lead a horse through water, but you can't make it drink, right? So it's like if somebody doesn't want to learn, it doesn't matter what you tell them, they're still going to be like, hey, what is simple syrup,
I'll ask that question every day of my life.
Yeah.
2 cups to 1 cup, or 1 cup to, I always,
Yeah, exactly.
who has a measuring cup?
How about for you, Brienne, especially because I feel like you probably come across such a wide array of different consumers, trade professionals. How do you learn how to navigate that and really effectively talking to an audience as you're trying to share whatever it is that they're interested in learning?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I write about wine for a lot of different publications. Some of them super trade focused, wine enthusiasts, but like of a certain caliber and level. So it's very technical, pretty hardcore, right? And that's on the writing side. And I really like to stretch that part of my knowledge. And, like I did that. I took those classes. I learned that. It's super cool to be able to share that. But then when I'm delivering wine education, it's almost exclusively to consumers. I've done over, I think, 300 virtual and in-person wine tastings for over 10,000 people, almost all consumers, because this is in a corporate setting. So these are just people who get this free event or virtual tasting as part of what their job is providing. And the thing to remember is that I always have to reframe when I'm working with consumers and enthusiasts that wine is not the centerpiece. So it really goes back to what you were saying, Elliot, which is that for us in the industry, we're wine people, we're spirits people, we want to geek out, we want to talk about intracellular fermentation and just all of those things or whatever. No one wants to hear that. So I really have to think about how to distill down the information into a way that people find it interesting, and also understanding that wine in the glass, which by the way, whenever I use this little bit in a talk, I like to have a glass of wine in front of me. It's one of the most boring things to look at. It's purple or yellow liquid in a glass. Spirits can be a little bit more exciting with cocktails and garnishes, but how are we taking this liquid, this colored liquid, and bringing it to people's lives? Like I said, most of them don't really care about stuff to the level that we do, but we want to talk to them in a way that it connects with them. I just recently was tasting some wine from Catena Wine, so I know we're going to, for some of us that are on a panel later today, we're going to taste one of Laura's wines. My family's from Argentina, and I just love that connection. Every damn time I open a bottle of Malbec from Argentina, I'm like, that's right. Like, I just feel really good about that. And I like sharing that with people. This is where my family's from, and I'm just really proud of this bottle of wine here. And then the other thing I was going to share was about, for those of us who have done formal wine education, the way that I describe it is that it's really all about, we spent all of our time and all of our money memorizing that grid. It's a little 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper with all these descriptors and things. That's not the real world. That's not what the rest of the world does. So for me, when I'm engaging with people that are not industry and trade, I want to jump off of the grid and into real life. That's how we're going to connect, right? So that's important to me. And like, I was just thinking about something during the pandemic. You mentioned, Rafaela, about virtual stuff and COVID things. I was all up in D-Nice's Club Quarantine. Remember those on Instagram? I loved listening to those. They were like so much fun. And so one time I did a virtual tasting, and the whole tasting was 2 different wines, and it was like, this wine is like D-Nice and this wine is like Questlove, and like the differences of what that meant. No one knew, or we didn't talk about the technical stuff, but we talked about how it made you feel, and it was two different vibes. So if you know Questlove and you know D-Nice, there's the DJs, just 2 different things. And that's a way to talk about wine. And the last thing I'll say really quickly is that we have to remember that you don't have to know anything to drink or enjoy wine. I think with education, there's this implication, I know things and I need to tell you and share it with you. That's not the case. We're trying to connect. We're trying to engage through this pretty boring liquid in a glass. And how can we do that?
I think that's genius, especially when, so we go back to so many people getting confused on, I have to remember what this word means or what this term means in order for me to enjoy it. And it's clearly not that. It's about connecting, right? And that's why we're all here. We're all looking to connect. We're all looking to understand how do we actually continue to improve and keep the evolution of wine and spirits moving forward. Rafaela, anything you care to share and add on to that?
Yeah. So I think y'all made such great points here. Something to add on is just going back to like getting the context of the student is understanding kind of what their language is and like what they understand. So this kind of ties that up together. But like you have the grid that we just talked about, which is a great like grid to have, right? Like cherry and high tannin and peach, gooseberry, whatever that means, jalapeno, right? Like, but okay, I'm going to Mexico. They have agua de Jamaica. They have like all of these flavors that, I understand as a consumer and they're going to get. So this is where like we should encourage the educator from like the side of WSET is to use that language that they're accustomed to and add it to their course. When it comes to, like the enthusiasts, sometimes like you said, like no one really cares beyond what am I drinking and okay, I like this Chardonnay. What else could I like if there's not going to be a Chardonnay on the list? So that might be the extent to it. In that case, it's just kind of getting the information and knowing how to lead them in that space. So,
and I think that's actually one of the things that's missing, in my opinion, whether, and maybe you can speak to this, Elliot, in terms of the spirit side, but definitely in wine, being able to have people see themselves in your product, see themselves in how we talk about it. I remember I was at a tasting one time and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm picking up so much tamarindo in this. And someone was like, you should not be getting that in this wine. And I was like, no, that's what I'm getting in this wine. And I swear, you guys, it tasted exactly like tamarindo. And I was like, I don't understand. But that's, I think, sometimes the problem when it comes to the industry, specifically of wine, right? Is we try to say, if it's not within this wheel, who created that wheel, first of all, and if it's not within that, then somehow we're wrong or we can't belong and then we don't feel seen. And so for me, I'm going to call that out as something that's missing. Anything that you feel is missing in terms of how the industry can be more inclusive when it comes to educating and providing, whether it's better descriptors or I don't want to start naming things and then take away your fire. So I'll just leave it at that.
I think with spirits, it's so different per spirit. But as I know that it is with wine, like I feel like with, vodka, for example, versus whiskey, a totally different crowd. Same with tequila versus mezcal, brandy versus like even cognacs, right? Cognac is brandy, but like, California brandy versus French brandy, so you just have a different crowd, for each one. So I think it's difficult in the spirit side to kind of take a general approach and say like, hey, this is how we become more inclusive because, whiskey nerds are so much more aggressive than, fans of gin. And so, but I think that's something that's kind of cool about it. It's a little bit endearing how passionate, people are about, bourbon versus rye versus scotch versus Japanese whiskey and stuff. And so, I feel like the problem comes when, treatment of a consumer starts to deteriorate because they aren't as educated. I think it's important to encourage the passion and sometimes even like pretension that people have for tasting spirits and wanting to know the nuance of it because, it is so few and far between. When you get someone that's like really passionate, you can also turn them into an advocate for your brand. But I think where it starts to take a left turn is when, like you said, like if you're saying like, oh, I'm really getting this flavor note from the spirit, and like, well, you shouldn't be getting that, and so they're kind of shaming you for not having the same palate that they might have. So that's the left turn. I think that's the thing to keep in mind, is just like, how is the treatment of the consumer or the person that you're trying to educate on your spirit, and encouraging them to continue to taste. But like I said, I think in the spirit side, it's so vast that I don't think you can really take a one size fits all approach to everything. Because I love vodka and I love whiskey. So that's my.
Do you feel like in the spirits industry, people try to take a one-size-fits-all approach, or have you seen that, and then the result of that is that it's a problem, like you said?
I think with spirits, it's broken down into like, is this a cocktail spirit, or is this a spirit used for mixing, or is this one for tasting, right? Different spirits have different price points. So if you have a bottle that's in the $60 to $70 range, it's maybe you don't want to use it in, a 7-ingredient cocktail versus like maybe a vodka that is a little quicker to produce than say a whiskey or a tequila. You might want it and produce it for, cocktails and high volume bars and stuff. So I think it really is different. That's kind of like the two buckets that I feel like spirits are broken into. How do you want people to enjoy it? Do you want them to sip it neat where they are pulling out, or like on ice where they are pulling out those flavor notes? Because like if you have a cocktail that has 7 ingredients, you're not going to pull out the flavor profile of that spirit, right? So it's produced for the purpose of cocktails. So I don't know if that answers the question, but like that's kind of how my brain thinks about it.
It did. No, you're solid. Rafaela, for you, especially when you were working with WSET, I mean, there are so many things for me personally that I can think of when it comes to whether it's formal education or just learning by tasting. What have you seen that's missing from WSET? Maybe not them specifically, if we don't want to call them out, but or we can call them out.
So I think, and WSET, maybe formal education or not formal education, I feel like, and maybe this is just here in the US, I was just talking to Brienne about this last night, but food is like the big thing that draws people to why they drink wine, right? It's like, why are we ignoring the fact that we start out with the meal and then we order our bottles? So I think that food should be a little bit more integral when it comes to wine education, not just like I think the awesome little, if anyone here has taken a level 1 course with WSET, you probably do like the little lemon, and then you take a sip of your glass and wow, look at how the acidity came down and the fruit forwardness came over. So like that is really cool, and that's an amazing starting point. But why not bring it into the context of food? Like, why are we drinking this wine? Why are we choosing this one? I'm going to be eating this particular thing. And then we get so caught up in, why is everyone thinking that like steak should go with red and fish should go with white? And we get so mad when people say that, right? But we're not bringing food into our conversations, I feel like, when it comes to education. Something that I was talking to Brienne last night is, when I go to Mexico, especially like a few years back with WSET, I would go a lot of times to different events or to wineries. A lot of the top wineries have a restaurant there, and that's kind of like their primal, reason for the visit is like, come to the restaurant. I understand that, like, yes, spatially, like you have to just go to one place because they're kind of far in between, but you go to the restaurant, you have your experience with the wines there. If you go to an event in Mexico, it's kind of like you've got quesos de Querétaro, de Guanajuato, you've got membrillo, you've got like all of these little snacks that are local to the area, and then wine is also served next to it. So it's just kind of like, I don't know, like when you think of, okay, vamos a tomarnos un vinito, like there's so many snacks and botanas, and that's like culturally what we do when we drink wine. So why not like bring that into wine education, especially in an informal way?
I definitely feel like I've seen that, almost like we're so hard pressed as an industry, specifically here in the United States, on it can only be wine first before you can get anything else involved, because you want to make that the primary thing. And it's not to say that wine on its own can't be the primary thing, but it's so much more beautiful when you're able to pair it with different foods that you like or create an entire experience around it, right? Like, how many of us want to go somewhere and have a terrible experience? We don't. And so it's like, how do we add layers and not, especially with younger consumers, from what I've seen, they're looking for something beyond just, why should I care about your wine when there's 10,000 different wines? What kind of environment are you setting up for me to enjoy the product? I'm not going there just for your wine. I want that and something else. Would you say that's pretty accurate?
Yeah, it kind of goes back to what I was saying before, which is that for us, wine is sort of the main character, the thing. But for a lot of people, wine is part of the ensemble. It's part of like the table, the food on the table, the people you're at the table with. You continue zooming out. Where are you? Are you on a vacation? Are you at someone's home? Is it a party? So it's really to me about zooming out of the glass, whereas in the industry, we tend to be hyper-focused on it. And then one other thing I just wanted to share about on the topic of your question is sort of thinking about how we show up in the industry. Actually, I'm sorry, not in the industry. How we show up publicly, those of us in the industry and trade and SOMs and things like that, because there is such a focus, I find, I used to find, and I sort of aspired to it. And now that I'm quote unquote here, I have a mixed relationship with it, which is it's the access to benchmark wines and sort of fetishization of baller bottles and things like that in the SOM world. And I think it has gone too far. It's like you haven't arrived until you're like in a suit with a pen, with like a bottle of DRC, like, yeah, I got to taste this. And I think that's cool. I mean, I want to go there and taste that DRC. I haven't had it yet, but I want to. But I think it's important that because this industry, I think, has a tendency to sort of get ahead of itself. And even we can get caught up in this stuff. It's kind of like the entertainment industry. You get caught up in all this other stuff. And what's important, I think, is how we show up and that we have gratitude and appreciation, but also humility. And think about other people that are new to this industry or who want to come into this industry, or just someone who wants to pick up a glass of wine and maybe their family's from Mexico and they don't feel like, we never had wine on our table, but I kind of like it and I don't want tequila or whatever. So I think it's important that we can be agile and show up in different ways. And I'm very lucky that I get to do that. I get to write like very strict UK-focused tasting notes and scores for Decanter magazine. It's a UK-based magazine. I also get to write listicles about my 5 favorite fun rosés for the summer. And I really enjoy doing both of those things. And same with education. It's really nice to be in front of a group who really knows about wine and you can kind of geek out a little bit and have fun. But then there's nothing more I love than when someone says, are there really cherries and plums in the wine? And I'm like, oh. I used to hate that question. I was like, oh my gosh, are we really going there again? But it's so fun. And that's actually what, during the pandemic, when I was doing so many corporate virtual tastings, that's when I really got away from the industry and into consumers again, into the face of consumers. And I was like, oh, I think I lost myself a little bit. I got caught up in all the things. And now it's really just about it's just about, you have a glass of wine in your hand. I have a glass of wine in my hand. Let's connect, let's charlear, whatever we want to do.
You hit the nail on the head right there with that one. And Elliot brought up the word earlier too, demystifying, right? Demystifying wine. I think we've definitely got to a point where if you haven't tasted, something from a super fancy old world area, and that has to be the standard of what means like the most excellent top wine, especially if it's got some really nice age to it, and people don't appreciate the new world as much. People certainly aren't venturing off into Argentina to taste as many things. How do businesses need to be adapting, institutions need to be adapting in both spirits and in wine as we think about just demystifying our approach and what that actually means, right? Like, who gets to say that the old world has to be better than the new world when there's a lot of really great wine made in Central America, in South America? Can any of you shed some information on that? I'll jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I was very fortunate to get to try a lot of local things in, for example, Brazil, Mexico. So taking from that experience, I think, and when you say like businesses, are we talking about like our local ones here in the way that we share,
and I think even just like, I mean, we have a room full. I see some winemakers that are here right now, and so even thinking about winemakers that we interact with, how can they also absorb and play into, no, the wine that I make here is just as great as an old world wine, right? And how do we as consumers equally learn to understand old world doesn't have to be the standard, and how do we attack and demystify, I guess, that concept?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, yeah. So when it comes to just like old world, new world, I know WSET right before I was leaving, they were putting out a lot of like reels and TikToks about this, but it was like, let's stop using old world, new world, because it does kind of categorize already, right? But I think, when it comes to how we communicate about it, it's a little bit hard, right? Because it's like, okay, how are we going to actually describe if we're talking about wine coming from a particular region? What I will say is I think that there's amazing stuff coming from the Americas. I think that right now our limitations are taxes, are trade wars essentially on like getting product from A to B. And that is limiting us from getting to experience all of that. But when it comes to local US wine, I think that us as consumers, have a very important role of giving respect to those winemakers and producers that we have here at home and understanding their products so that we also can create a little bit more of a narrative of how we are going to describe what we term as New World. Because I think right now it's very prescriptive. It's like, oh, the book tells me that I should be looking for this, this, and this. Whereas maybe us as consumers, we should try to order certain wines coming from these general areas just so we can create our own vocabulary. On the flip side, with like the winery, maybe it's the point of let me get in front of certain consumers and talk about my wine in a general style that, works in tandem with those particular consumers. So, a lot of people tend to use the word fruity. So what am I going to use to sub for that word that gives it a little more definition? So anyway, that hopefully answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Does it look different, Elliot, in the spirits world, or even demystifying the approach to spirits? And you mentioned like earlier Japanese whiskey, and then I know I'm not that well versed in whiskey, but I'm assuming there's a lot of different whiskeys out there.
With spirits, I mean, I feel like as a brand, you only have, I feel like, 3 ways that you can educate your consumer. Like you can be face to face, especially if you have a distillery. Not every brand has a distillery, right? So like you're relying on trade shows or things that you're doing, or like tastings at on-premise accounts and stuff. You rely heavily on like bartenders. So there's a lot of like industry education to be able to like have them be an advocate for your brand and tell you about it. And then, I feel like third is social media, which is kind of where I've made my, what I've made my focus, for brands, spirit producers and stuff. I really think that social media is one, it's free, right, for you. But also two, it's an amazing way to educate the masses on how you want them to enjoy your spirit, how you want them to, how you want them to learn about your spirit. You control, the information that you're putting out on your own channel. And so I think that's a really big way, because you can't always control how a bartender talks about your spirit. They might, maybe a big brand took them down to their distillery, wine and dined them, and now like they're an advocate for that brand and don't give any, attention to any of the other brands in their well. But again, coming from hospitality at home and being focused on like drinks at home, I rely a lot on what I see on social media. And so I think that how a brand talks about itself and how the content that it produces and how consistent they are really matters. Because again, it's free. So I'm a big believer in that. And then two, just the opportunity to speak to someone one-on-one, but that's a tough thing to rely on, especially if you're trying to do what you're doing at scale. So again, I kind of rely heavily on digital marketing to kind of inform people about your spirit.
And I'm very excited for our upcoming marketing panel that we have coming up next. But Brianne, for you, one thing that I definitely wanted to ask you, especially since you get to taste so many wines and write about so many wines, when we think about demystifying wine and old world versus new world, and I'm thinking about like Brazilian sparkling and like really awesome places that we don't really get to discover. How is your approach, even in how you write, whether it's to a consumer, to a trade publication, how does that change and evolve, and what's your approach to, I guess, reshaping that story?
Yeah, I think in the wine industry specifically, I'm not as familiar with the spirits industry. There's larger factors at play here, which is like our lovely 3-tier system and distribution and all those fun things that we have to deal with. So I'm keenly aware that a lot of the wines that I'm talking about could be on social media, in an article, a blog, whatever. People will never have that wine in their hand. It's lovely to think that you're going to, quote unquote, influence someone to buy that bottle because you just did such a good job of saying how amazing it was or gave it a good score or whatever it is. But that's not the reality of it because of the 3-tier system and access to wine in different places. So one thing that when I do have one-on-one interactions, or when I'm doing an education class for people, like a corporate group or something, I tell them, I say, these wines are lovely. I'm going to have one wine maybe that is in wide distribution. You can kind of find it everywhere. One's a small boutique wine that I had shipped to me, and like unless they physically go there or order that wine on that one website, that's the only place they'll find it. Maybe there's something in the middle. And I remind them, wine is fleeting. Like you will like never see some of these wines again. The new vintage is coming. Everything's changing. So it's not about like there's all the apps and everything. It's like, oh, you're supposed to taste all your wine and take pictures and write notes and share it and have someone buy the wine. And it's a little bit more about being in the moment, I think, and just saying, like I said, we enjoyed this glass of wine together, proverbially, or maybe we actually did. And you maybe had some light bulb in your head or something I said connected with you, and your experience having your next glass of wine, whatever the hell glass of wine it is, I don't know, might be a little bit better because of my contribution there. So I try to think of it that way. There's nothing more than I love than when someone on social media posts a bottle and they're like, I got this because of you. That is awesome when you can have that direct correlation, but it just doesn't always happen. And then just zooming back out to your original question that Elliot was touching on, and Rafaela, about brands and how they can show up differently, is kind of what I was saying earlier, is that, wine is it's not the main character. It's part of the ensemble. So I think it would do brands good to show up in spaces that are not just wine-centric. Don't just reach out to wine influencers. Don't just submit your wines to wine magazines for scores. Don't just, we could go on and on and on. I was just in Italy. I was in northern Italy a month ago in Alba in Piemonte, and I'm walking down the street, little Alba, it's a charming little town. All of the boutiques had the displays, with the little models doing their thing, and there was wine. Alba wines right there, Alta Langa Sparkling, Barolo, Barbaresco, just displayed there like it was the handbag or the shoes. And it was just so simple, and I was just like, oh my gosh, because that's something that sort of wine thinkers in our industry are talking about, is we need to like get out of our echo chamber, get out of our little world, and because most people aren't like, most people don't wake up and think about, what wine am I going to buy today? We think about wine all the time, but most people don't. I always say the same things over and over again. So how can we show up in spaces? How can our wines, if you're a winemaker, if you're a brand, show up in spaces that are not just wine-centric? I think Bottle Rock's a great example. One of the founders of Bottle Rock spoke on a panel recently that I attended, and people thought they were crazy when they're like, we're going to have a music festival, which everyone knows what musical festival is. You think of like Coachella with flower crowns, or there's like different festivals you think of, and the vibe. And everyone's like, you can't sell wine. And they told him, you can't sell wine at a music festival. That is not what people go for. And that has completely changed. And I know they've just started a new festival, La Onda, right? So that's a perfect example of thinking about wine and bringing it in spaces where it isn't normally seen. And being like, I have a feeling that this will work out, And then the last thing I'll say about, showing up in the new world versus old world, which I don't know how to describe it any differently because that's just how I learned it. So I'm excited to see how we figure that out. But, I always think about, my grandma always said this, it wasn't her saying, it exists in the world. Be the change that you want to see in the world. So last night we had a meet and greet, and I decided to bring a Mexican wine. I was like, that's how I was going to be like, look, we make some delicious wine, and it was Vinos Lechuza in Valle de Guadalupe that is now at French Laundry, in case anyone's wondering. They serve it there, and they're one of the OGs in the Valley. And that was my way of just saying, you know what? Yes, on my Instagram, you're going to find me with some baller bottle that I had in Italy or whatever. And we all do it because it's like, yes, this wine is amazing. But I'm also going to rep and show pride for my people. And that's the one thing I think all of us have in this room, but no matter what country we're from, where we're from, is Latinos have major orgullo, and that like never ends. And so that's something we can do every day as we show up in this industry.
Amen to that. I just have one last question, and then I'm going to open up to anybody in the audience who maybe might have some questions. We've kind of brought up technology a lot. You know, how do you see the role of education, whether it's formal or whatever that looks like, right? We've kind of opened up what that term looks like throughout this time, really evolving and changing as our technology continues to evolve and change. Sort of like, where are we going? What have been the most helpful tools for you in either communicating a brand story or like how to educate about that product? And equally on the consumer side, or what can maybe even some businesses take away on how they can approach other people through technological platforms?
Oh, I'll just go just because I have something on my mind here. I don't use technology in a lot of ways with wine, so I don't have anything to share there. But I think what's super interesting is artificial intelligence and wine. And one thing I've seen is that there have been so many different apps and platforms that show up and say, we're going to be your new wine suggestion platform, right? You like just answer these 5 questions. It's like the Cosmo quiz, right? And then we're going to tell you what wine you like. And I think they've all sort of failed. I mean, that's kind of where we are. There's been a lot of money going into these companies. So I'm personally excited to see if that nut can be cracked, because I think it's interesting. I mean, there is a human element to it. So it can't just be the few questions and we're going to just figure it out for you. But I think that to me is the most exciting. And I mean, AI in general is just very exciting and also scary, but it's, you know, it'll be interesting to see how that eventually can help consumers and enthusiasts, going back to just pick a wine and find a wine that they like and enjoy without having that feeling when they walk up to the wall of bottles and like, I don't know what to get. You know, that's my job. I'm not a wine educator. I'm not a wine writer. My job is to like that feeling in the pit of your stomach when you walk up to the wall of bottles. It chills out a little bit and you're like, I'm good. I'm just going to pick this bottle here and everything's fine.
I've definitely walked in a couple of aisles and you just see people standing there for like minutes on minutes. I'm like, are they going to make a decision? Does that look different in the spirits world in terms of technology? I mean, I know you have been able to share so much because of social media and that really being your virtual tool.
Yeah, I think with technology, you know, you have your website, you have your social media channels. I think as a content creator, the technology platforms that you have available aren't really going to change drastically where social media is going to go away or your website's going to go away. I think what changes is the type of content that you create, right? So when I first started out, photography was big, right? Everyone was shooting on their phones, and then I started shooting on my camera and it was like mind-blowing, and then I feel like that was a big reason why I grew. And then as TikTok changed, you know, it became short form video, YouTube introduced like long form video, and then now Instagram has really shifted towards like reels and stuff. So like the type of content that you create is what changes. So I think the most important thing for a brand is to stay consistent with a mix of content and lean a little bit more into the things that are working, right? So if like people are consuming reels, you know, as a photographer, it breaks my heart that everything is like short form video now, and I hate it in a lot of ways because it just takes so much more time. But I do think it's important to adapt and to change with the platforms. And that's why I also really think it's important to really lean into your own website. And like you had mentioned, show up in places that you otherwise wouldn't think about, especially in a digital capacity, you know, getting in, you know, trying to get into different media outlets and stuff. But, you know, I think that's really important. It's just to stay consistent with how are people digesting information, you know, is it video content and like testing that out, but still having a mix. I also like to advise, like, don't feel like as a brand or as a producer that you have to trend chase, you know, all the time. That like if I don't post this type of reel, if I don't use like trending audio, that nobody's going to know my brand and nobody's going to want to try my stuff. So I think that can be really overwhelming as well, and feeling like you have to do everything. I think it's more about having a good mix and having consistency and frequency in what you're doing. That's more important than trend chasing and trying to do everything. You don't have to be on every single platform. You know, pick the ones that are really consistent, pick the ones where you feel like your community is really leaning into, and be there.
I love that. And for somebody who doesn't like doing videos. So you are very great at doing
Thank you.
videos. If you
My mortgage depends on it, you know?
Yeah, I guess, when you've got a biscuit to get after you
Got a toddler.
Rafa, did you want to add anything before I open it up to the audience?
I feel the same way as Brienne on this. Right now, I think we're at such like an early turning point of artificial intelligence that even at my time with WSET, like there were a lot of questions of like, what does this mean for the way that we formalize education? Like, is this a threat? Is this going to be helpful? Is this an opportunity for us? So I think there's still so many questions that it's a little bit hard to kind of add more to this. But yeah, I hope that we could use it as an opportunity. I think that, so many people use Vivino. I know like from our side of like the wine industry, it's like, but there's so much more than just, what others think about the wine and the reviewers and whatnot. But I think this is such a great opportunity for the winemakers, for the wineries to really push their stories forward, and really make sure that they're reaching the audiences, whether it be social media, content creation, but really push the story of like why you're doing what you're doing and try to like just use your voice. Because as we said, it is just a glass of wine. Like, why does this wine make it more important and why should it be part of your life? So
beautifully said. Although I will share with those quizzes always gets me with sparkling wine, and that's totally my jam. So it kind of knows me. It kind of knows. Does anybody in the audience have any questions that they would like to ask anyone up here? And that's okay if we don't. Yeah.
So just a simple question. I wonder if you could talk about generational differences in what people are interested in, how much they know, that kind of thing.
The thing that I'll speak to, because I'm dealing and working mostly with consumers, is that I was not in the industry back in the day when sort of the importance was placed on collecting wine, benchmark wines, just like really like wine, not as like this active dynamic thing that you're consuming, but it's sort of like this thing that's over there behind a case and you're paying someone to store it for you and all that. So I think my take is that the younger generation, the newer generation, is more interested in it's all the same themes. It's not just about wine and like collecting it and like somebody said that this is this score and that we should hold on to it for 20 years. A lot of people aren't doing that anymore. So I think a lot of people are touching and feeling and enjoying their wine more regularly versus just having this, this proverbial cellar that they're collecting and things like that. So that's something I try to think about, is that I think it used to be that somms and wine educators and consultants, big focus was on collecting and like what that looks like. But now it's like I said, it's me getting you closer to finding a glass of having you find a glass of wine that like knocks your socks off. That's the goal. So that's to me more important and less about, and that's ironic because I do taste and score for some major worldwide magazines. So there is a whole, but that's just the world. There's opposing forces always at play here. Is that yes, I do those tasting scores and reviews that are, put on shelves around the world. But when people ask me how important are their scores, I'm like, not really that important, really, in the context of things. But if somebody's looking at that shelf overwhelmed and they see, a score versus not a score, that might make them buy the bottle. Doesn't mean the bottle's better, but it just made the decision a little easier for them. So I'm happy to participate in that.
I'd love to jump in here real quick from like the young perspective of wine drinkers. And I want to give a shout out to my friend Zach in Chicago. He has this awesome place called Easy Does It. And I think a few of you here might have gone, yes. So this place is a wine bar pretty much throughout the day. It's open. They have majority natural wines, really great producers. They have an amazing wine Bible, as they call it. But around like 8 p.m., it becomes basically a nightclub. And it's open till like 2 a.m, 3 a.m, and you're seeing young people walking around with bottles of wine, glasses of wine on the dance floor. And it's just so cool because that is the direction that wine should go into. And I'd love to see more spaces like that where it's like wine isn't the primary focus. The focus is we're going out, we're having a good night. Wine is going to be part of that experience. So I think that he really just like got the perfect, just kind of like, recipe to the young audience. And almost everyone in there is in their 20s. So it's just, again, like the same theme that we've been covering, like how can we bring in more things into the wine space to make it interesting for people?
So what varieties are those that the young generation's drinking? Is it Cabernet, Pinot? What exactly is it?
Oh, that's a really good question. I don't know that we can really answer that right now, though, because there are, well, number one, like the younger audience, they're very new, right? They're still kind of discovering. I think what's safe to say is like they're probably going to the stores where you see Chardonnay, Cab, Pinot Noir. So, I mean, and those are the names that are the easiest ones to pronounce and the easiest ones to hear in conversations and on TV shows. You're watching a reality TV show and someone says, I'll order the Cab. So it's just like taking all of those experiences that they have and then applying them to the real world because they're so new. But I don't know that we really have varieties that are, wow, the young generation is really going towards these, or that we can say that this is definitive. Do y'all think that there's
I don't think
particular
it's
ones?
necessarily specific varieties, but I would say, and you mentioned this earlier, they're really curious consumers. And so I think that they're very willing and open to taste anything and everything simply so that they can say like, do I like that or do I not like that? And I think that's what a lot of the younger generation is currently looking to do, is just figure out, instead of having somebody tell me what I'm supposed to enjoy, I want to figure out what I actually enjoy. And so they're willing to taste it all.
I think you had mentioned something too, like if I can toss this in, what are they drinking? You had mentioned like having food part of that. So I would also add like, well, what are they eating? Because especially being at home, like you're thinking if you're cooking for yourself, what are the main things that you're eating at home and consuming at home? And as somebody that's like not as well versed in wine as I am in spirits, I can tell you like I think very categorical about it. I'm like, okay, like you said, Pinot Noir, Sauv Blanc, and that stuff. So like if I'm having pasta or something, I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to go a white. And what are the whites that I do know? If you guys start talking to me about this wine and that wine, and, you had mentioned some towns in Italy I've never heard of. So I'm like, all right, I'm gonna trust you on this, but like I'm gonna go with what I know. And so like I think for a younger generation, especially in spirits, we think very categorically about stuff similar to like bourbon and stuff. People are gonna reach for a bourbon versus an American single malt, because American single malt is a category that is still people like, does America make, is that Scotch? They don't really understand it. So it's that's kind of like what I'm thinking is like, well, what are they eating? Because what they're eating might dictate like what they're drinking.
It's a great point.
And then I'll just add that one thing that I find very interesting now, going back to the question of the younger generation and what they might be drinking, I think there's a movement towards sort of democratizing how we present wine, whether it's on a wine list, at a wine shop. One of the first wine shops that I ever saw this at was Bay Grape. Years ago, 10, 15 years ago, or whenever it was, where the store was organized. This is a wine shop. I think it was in Oakland, the first one that I went to. They organized by sort of style and body. So like light and fruity, fun and fresh, big and bold, deep and brooding, versus old world, new world, Cab, Merlot, Pinot. And that gives people that ability to not just call the grape, because that's something, I mean, we've all done it, hey, what's, somebody says, oh, you know a lot about wine, like what wine should I drink or whatever. And then you say, what do you like? And they go Cab, or they say Pinot, or they say Chardonnay, or they say Sauv Blanc. That's basically what they say. And it's not because that's the only thing they like, it's because that's just what they know. And maybe there's a little bit of trepidation around that, like, am I supposed to say something else? They don't know. So they're just like Cab. And I think that those stylistically focused lists and shops are really interesting to me, because it takes away that you have to know something. Going back to, you don't have to know anything to drink and enjoy wine. Young kids these days, they like their chilled, crushable reds. We can talk about, oh, that's Cinsault or Gamay or Pais, but they don't really know that. They just know that they like their wine easy drinking, low tannin, slightly chilled, dope. Natural wine's very similar too. That's what I love about natural wines. You don't have to know a lot. Let me tell you, I got my WSET diploma. I go to a natural wine bar. I don't know what's happening. I have no idea what's happening, but I am excited, and I'm gonna explore, and it's fun. And they might organize it by color. They might organize it by like scale of funk, like this is like more like wine, more like kombucha, super fun, all the different things. So I think that's a movement that I've been seeing with the next generation, that I think is kind of exciting, and it goes along with all the themes we've been talking about.
Yep. Lynette, I have time for one last question. Do you want to say something?
I think crazy grapes, even some people planting Albarino in different regions. So I think the more creativity is what's bringing the new wine person in, and this started for us with spirits, and it's now that same consumer. They're taking the same approach, right? Mezcal was a tiny category, and it expanded because people started feeling that connection to culture, community where they were going, and wine has this really beautiful opportunity to kind of break all the boundaries, bring the Mexican wine into the programs, challenge people's thoughts and process, and like you said, they don't describe it the same way of us. It's not, they will respond to so many different things. So I think those are the ways you really lean into it for your sales and for distribution for different types.
100%. And that's a great segue into the next panel that we have coming up next, which is thinking about beyond just the bottle. So I want to give a big round of applause to our incredible speakers, Brianne, Alia, and Rafaela. Thank you so much.